record on this computer. Then additionally, I'd like to please take a moment to acknowledge that UCSD is on the land of the Kumeyaay people. Yeah. All right, cool. And then I guess I had a little icebreaker in here, and that's like, do you listen to a specific type of music when you code? So y'all can answer that if you want, don't have to.
I don't. I like to
I
listen to
don't
piano
code.
music.
Oh,
Yeah, that too.
That's interesting.
if I would, I would listen to like lo-fi,
The little like,
little
whatchamacallit.
jazzy beats.
Yeah, those are pretty nice. I listen
Yeah.
to those if I get distracted by the lyrics one, but usually I just listen
Yeah,
to my normal
exactly.
music. I know one of my former roommates would listen to like the Nintendo music.
The
So that's
Nintendo
always
music.
fun. Yeah. All right, cool. Let's just get into the slides. So yes, introduction to Python. Let's get into it. First off, what exactly is Python? It is a popular programming language that's used in a variety of disciplines. It's used in so many disciplines because it has a lot of different advantages, such as it's free to download and use, which a lot of other programs can't claim. It's compatible with a lot of different operating systems, including Windows, Macs, Raspberry Pi, etc. It has a fairly simple syntax, so it's pretty easy to pick up. Is able to connect with database systems, so you can process large amounts of data with it. And it can perform complicated mathematics similar to MATLAB, but just, even more. So it's a very versatile program, and it's it's very accessible for anyone. So it's a pretty nice program. There's a couple different ways you can access and use Python. So one such way is to download it directly onto your computer. I have links for each of these icons here, and I can send those in the chat later. But one is to download it through the Python website. One is to use Jupyter Notebooks, which is very similar. You still have the same functionality as downloading Python, but what you do is instead it's online. And these are nice because you can like share it with people and all work on it at the same time. Same with Google Colab, so that's another like online platform for using Python. And that's another thing where you can collaborate with a bunch of different people. So there's a couple different ways you can access Python. Again, very easily accessible. Oh, I did not mean, oh man. Okay, hold on. I accidentally clicked on one of the links. Do you guys still see my presentation screen?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I accidentally clicked on one, it like rerouted me and I was like, ah man. Okay. So getting started, there's a couple of things you should know about using Python before you're getting started. One is that, if we talk about Python files, they're going to have the extension .py. So if you see a file with that extension, just know it's for Python. You can open it in Python. And when you save, or if you save a file, that's the kind of thing that you'll want to save it to. Just another note, good coding practice, please save before running anything. You don't want to, waste your work. And that goes for any type of method that you're using to access Python. Another thing is that if you've used MATLAB before, it's kind of similar in that it has one way to look at the display of data or to input simple commands, and it has one thing, and that's called shells, and that's similar to the command window in MATLAB. And then you can also use the file window, which is more similar to writing a script, where you can make a more complex command or like a function or several functions or whatever that you can edit and save and return to. So if you're doing something more complex, you should consider opening a file window rather than a shell window. Yeah, and then another last thing before we get into some of these basics is that, how you interact with Python will obviously depend a little bit on whatever interface you choose, like whether it's Jupyter Notebook or, downloaded Python. It's going to look a little bit different, but it should all be fairly similar, and you should be able to find documentation that applies to everything. The examples that I use in this slideshow are from Jupyter notebooks. So that's, what it will look like if you're trying to replicate it yourself. Some of the other interfaces might look a little bit differently, but they'll have the same functionality. Okay, so the basics. So let's just start with variable assignment. So variable assignment is basically saying like, okay, yeah, this letter or phrase or whatever gets this value. That's performed with one equal sign, and you can do that either with numbers or as strings. And then another important thing that a lot of people end up using in their functions is Boolean logic. So that's kind of comparing two values and then determining their relationship to one another, and it returns true or false depending on that comparison. And that's usually done with one of the four things that's kind of pictured here, either two equal signs, an exclamation, an equal sign, or the greater than or less than signs. And then also, as you can see in this example, pound signs can be used for commenting. So that's fun if you want to take little notes on what your code is doing. Okay, more basics. Strings. Strings are like a different type of, how do I put this? Basically, it's a type of data that you can have within Python. Anything can be a string, including numbers, and it affects what kind of operations that you can perform. So be careful of whatever type your variable is when trying to carry out any operations, because it might lead to some errors. But yeah, strings, you can usually tell that they're strings because they have the apostrophes around them. And you can, once again, make anything into a string. You can do that by using the str function. And then you can also convert from a string into an integer using the int function. Strings are pretty useful because you can do these kind of operations with them, such as concatenating with them, even though they're not like numbers or particular values. So for example, I have down here that workshop Wednesdays are the EWB best. And that's something that I did by concatenating strings by listing each out and having the plus operator in between each of those and then printing that. So yeah, basically just made one long string and then printed it. Okay, so another thing that's important to know when using Python is if-else statements. So if-else statements will allow you to execute a specific task depending on what conditions are met. And then do that. That was not very astute, forgive me. So for example, in this picture I have here, I have X and Y assigned to be 5. And as those, and I have the if else statement to be that if X equals Y, then the output statement is that X and Y are equal, and to print that. However, if that statement is not true, if that condition is not met, it will follow the else statement, and we'll print this other output statement. So this is a pretty useful tool, and it can be used in a variety of things. One thing to note about this is that a colon should be after each if or else condition statement. Otherwise it won't function. And there's also no end statement. So again, if you're familiar with MATLAB, like like a lot of UCSD students are, please keep that in mind. Okay, so more things. You can also use Python to like generate number lists, and you can do that using the range function. And when you do that, you can input the minimum, the maximum, and then the step in between. So in this photo, I have like A equals the range from 0 to 10, stepped by 2. So that would be like 0, 2, 4, 6, etc. And then another helpful tool is for loops. So for loops will perform a task as it iterates through a given set. So as you see in this photo here, it says for I, which is like a indexing variable in A. So in that previously defined number list, it will loop through each of those things and perform that statement. So for the first value of A, it'll add 1. For the second value of A, it'll add 1, and it'll keep going through that. And then you can see kind of the output of that print over here. Okay, so another loop function that's really helpful is a while loop. So while loop will have a code running repeatedly until a condition is satisfied. So this is helpful if you're trying to find like tolerances or thresholds or something like that. The example I have here is adding 1 to a certain value until it reaches whatever we want it to reach. So while C is less than 5, it says to add 1 to C. We'll keep going through that loop until it reaches 5. As you can see, as the printed output. Okay, so another thing that you'll probably use when working with Python is functions. Also, sorry, can y'all still hear me? My headphones just died.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, so functions can be called with, or functions are basically just like more specific code that you can define in one of the, whatchamacallit, the more specific windows that we were talking about earlier. And you can use that to be really specific with what you want to do to a code, and then you can call it later with whatever you've defined as your inputs to have that operation done. So to define it, you can use def, and then whatever your function name is, your input value, and then kind of write out underneath that what exactly that function is. And then when you want to call it later, if it's already been defined, you can just have that function name and that input value. So for example, in this first like box or a line, or I'm not quite sure exactly what it's called, but in this first box in Jupyter Notebook, I defined this function as name to be weekend, having an input of whatever day, and then use that input value to create this function that says I have however many days left until the weekend. And then you can see in the next line, even though that's not in the same box as where I defined it, I was able to call it by having that function name and inputting something for that value. Okay, so something that's more unique to Python is the idea of packages. So Python packages are similar to a library of functions or files, and they can be really helpful for a specific task. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide, but you can kind of think of it as like a flow chart as pictured on the screen, where it has like the package, overall what it is, and then some of these sub packages with functions or files within them. And you can import these in a couple different ways. So you can import using dot notation. The next slide will also show a different way to import this, but let's stick with dot notation for now. So this dot notation is basically indicating that we want to import the game. And then if you go down to kind of the sub package of level, so game level, and then down yet another level to the start file specifically. So the extension py is not included, but just the name of that file. So there's a lot of different Python packages out there. This icon up here links to the Python package index, which has like a lot. It's a repository of a lot of different packages. There's something for everyone in there pretty much. Okay, so let's think about importing data with packages. So some of the packages that might be of interest to you based on what you're doing is these two packages, NumPy and MATLAB, or matplotlib.pyplot. I'm not quite sure how to say that. Those two packages might be of interest to you for importing data, because NumPy will help with data importing, reading from tables and such,
and then the other one will help you plot data. And this example also shows you a different way you can import those by using the like import as, and that's also just like giving it another name. So it's easier to call when you're using it later. So in the case of importing data using these packages, you can import those packages and then reference that package when you're importing your data. So you'll see in this photo here, you can create this variable by saying, okay, call MP, call this specific function in there of load text, and then have the inputs of that function, which is like the name of the file that you want to include, and then the delimiter, which is like what separates the data basically. So that helps the function read that. And that'll be dependent on whatever your data type is, but that's very specific to case by case. And then from there, you can, define your data and be able to do all these different things with it. And you can do that by referencing the row numbers and column numbers to separate out into like, oh, if I want this vector, this variable or whatever. So this next slide is dealing with plotting. So these are calling the functions that I mentioned from that PLT package that we imported on the previous slide. And this will allow you to plot, create legends, create X labels, create Y labels, and then like display that plot. I think those are pretty self-explanatory, but let me know if you have any questions about what those might mean. Okay, and then I have some practice exercises here. So I can actually going to stop recording and stop sharing for a moment. Resuming recording. Nice. All right, so thank you for going through those practice exercises with me. Hopefully they help demonstrate some things, particularly to remember the colon. It's important. Okay, and then just some last notes. There's a lot of resources for Python, both in like the documentation and on YouTube and just everywhere. So yeah, there's resources out there. Please, if you need them, don't be shy about looking for them. I've included a nice little cheat sheet here, as well as some videos to get you started. And then if you click on this icon, it'll also bring you to the Engineers for a Cause YouTube channel, where we will have this Python workshop posted, as well as previous Python workshops. So that can also be a starting point. Okay, and then lastly, thank you for coming. Thank you for your attendance. And stay tuned for a part 2 workshop. We will have one in week 8 focused on using Python for data analysis specifically. So it'll be a little bit more in depth than what we did today, a little bit more specific to data analysis. I'd also like to say thank you to Quality of Life Plus. This workshop is modeled off of a Quality Life Plus EWB Python workshop from last year. So yes, thank you to them. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.